What if the one thing, the one single thing you've spent half a century searching for, isn't what you think it is? What if the truth you're chasing is actually chasing you? For 70-year-old John Baker, a retired carpenter from the quiet rolling hills of Ohio, this wasn't just a trip. This was a reckoning, a final desperate appointment with a ghost he had carried with him for 50 long years. The air in the international terminal at LAX, it hummed, a low electric thrum of chaotic energy, an energy John hadn't felt since the last time he was on his way to Asia. But this time was different, so profoundly different. There was no olive drab uniform stretched tight across the shoulders of a boy trying to look like a man. There were no draft orders folded and refolded in a nervous pocket. There was just a rumpled off-white linen shirt bought specifically for the humidity and a single flimsy plane ticket to Ho Chi Minh City, clutched in a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. In his other hand, the one that felt like it still belonged to a younger man, he held the photograph. You could hardly call it that anymore. It was more like a relic, a soft paper talisman, its edges worn down to a gentle fringe, not by time in a box, but by the constant worried rubbing of a thumb for 50 years. Every line on his own face, etched by time and sun and sorrow, seemed to correspond to a crease on its surface. It showed a young Vietnamese woman. Her name was Mai. She was standing in front of a storefront, the name of it long since faded into a silver-gray blur. But her face was as clear in his mind as the day it was taken. Her eyes, they held the collective, weary sadness of a nation at war. But deep within them, if you looked close enough, there was a spark, a glint of fierce, unbreakable defiance. It was the spark that had captured him then, and it was the spark that had haunted him every single day since. He could almost feel the weight of her small hand in his, just for a moment. He remembered the smell of the rain on the Saigon pavement, and the sweet, cloying scent of the jasmine flowers she sometimes tucked behind her ear. Ghosts, all of it. Tucked behind her image, a secret kept safe for half a century, was another, smaller photograph. A ghostly promise, printed on thin, curling paper. It was an ultrasound, a grainy, abstract landscape of blacks and grays, with one tiny, unmistakable shape at its center, a small, perfect curve, a spine, a head, a life, his son. For 50 years, that ethereal, black and white image was the only proof he ever really existed. John had never heard his voice. He'd never seen him smile. He'd never felt the grip of his tiny fingers around his own. He was a phantom, built of hope and memory and unbearable, crushing guilt. Now, after a lifetime of excuses, of fear, of telling himself it was better to leave the past alone, John was finally going back. He looked around the terminal, at the young families laughing, at the businessmen rushing past on their cell phones, at the world that had moved on so completely. He felt like an anachronism, a man out of time chasing a ghost from another era. He wasn't going back to fight a war. He was going back to end one, the one that had been raging inside his heart, a silent, bloody battle every single day since he boarded that C-130 transport plane and left everything that mattered on the tarmac below. He was going to find his boy. He was going to hold his son's hand. For the first time, it was a simple goal, a pure, elemental need that had finally, in the twilight of his life, become more powerful than the fear that had paralyzed him for so long. The fear was a living thing. It whispered to him in the dead of night. What if he hates you? It would hiss. What if he wants nothing to do with you? What if you finding him only brings him pain? He had listened to that voice for decades. It was the reason his first marriage had failed. It was the reason he always kept a certain distance, even from those who loved him. A part of him was always over there, in a past he couldn't escape. But something had shifted. Maybe it was his 70th birthday. Maybe it was the quiet face of his own mortality, looking back at him from the mirror each morning. The fear was still there, coiled in his stomach like a cold snake. But now it was accompanied by a new, more terrifying thought. What if you die without ever trying? That was the one ghost he knew he couldn't live with, or die with. So he'd bought the ticket, packed a single small suitcase with a few shirts, a bottle of pills for his heart, and nothing else of consequence. Everything of consequence was right here in his hand. The photograph was his map, the ultrasound was his compass, and the hope, the fragile 50-year-old hope, was his fuel. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the recycled airport air tasting of plastic and jet fuel. This was it, the final mission. No turning back. He stood up, his old knees protesting. He walked towards the gate, each step feeling both heavy and impossibly light. He was just an old man walking through an airport, but inside, he was a young soldier, finally going home. If you believe that some stories are so powerful they can change a life, that the past is never truly past, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of the Past. You don't want to miss a single moment of this incredible journey. The flight itself was a long 18-hour dream, a purgatory suspended between two worlds. John didn't sleep. Not really. He would close his eyes, but the images that came weren't of rest. They were of jungles, slick with rain, of the faces of boys he once knew, their youth frozen forever in the amber of his memory. He would drift, then jolt awake, his heart hammering against his ribs, the recycled air in the cabin feeling thin and cold. For hours he simply stared out of the small oval window at the endless deep blue of the Pacific. Then at the velvet black of the night sky, punctured by a billion indifferent stars. In the reflection on the triple-paned glass, he saw two faces superimposed. One was his own, an old man, his skin loose around the jaw, his eyes clouded with a lifetime of unspoken sorrow. And beneath that face, a ghost in the glass, was the other him, the boy. The 19-year-old soldier with a jaw set in a hard line, trying desperately to look brave. He was flying the same route in the opposite direction 50 years ago. That boy had no idea what was waiting for him. And this old man had no idea either. He kept his hand in his pocket, his fingers wrapped around the photograph. It was his anchor, his rosary, the one tangible thing connecting the boy in the glass to the old man in the seat. Then through the clouds it appeared, a coastline, a patchwork of impossibly green rice paddies, and the winding brown ribbon of a river. Vietnam. A word that had been a whisper, a curse, a prayer on his lips for his entire adult life. And now it was just land, green and solid and real beneath him. The plane banked and the city spread out below, a sprawling, glittering carpet of light against the dawn. The thud of the landing gear locking into place was a physical jolt, a sound that seemed to say, "There is no turning back now." When the wheels finally touched the tarmac, a firm, solid connection with the ground he had fled. The impact traveled up through the seat and settled deep in his chest. He was here. The moment the plane doors opened, the air hit him. It wasn't just a change in temperature. It was a physical blow, a thick, wet blanket of humidity that instantly coated his skin, his clothes, his lungs. It was an atmosphere you could taste. And the smell, my God, the smell, it was a ghost of a scent. He remembered the smell of jet fuel, yes, the smell of damp, rotting vegetation, but this was different. That old ghost was still there, but it was now layered, wrapped in the vibrant, undeniable perfume of a city that had utterly refused to die. The sharp, savory scent of garlic and star anise from a pot of pho simmering somewhere nearby. The acrid tang of diesel fuel from 1,000 motorbikes. And underneath it all, the sweet, loamy smell of rain-soaked pavement and tropical earth. It was the scent of life. Loud, chaotic, and unapologetic. He walked down the jet bridge on unsteady legs, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. The airport was new, gleaming, all glass and steel and advertisements for Samsung phones. Nothing like the chaotic, sandbag terminal he remembered at Tan Son Nhut. Nothing. The Saigon he remembered was a city of held breaths, a city of military jeeps and nervous whispers and the constant low thrum of helicopters that was the soundtrack to every dream and every waking moment. A city of beautiful, sad-eyed women and soldiers who were too young to be there, all of them living on borrowed time. The Ho Chi Minh City that greeted him now, it was a dazzling, roaring, defiant metropolis. The taxi ride from the airport was a dizzying immersion. 1,000,000 motorbikes flowed around their car like a metallic river, a symphony of small engines and beeping horns. Entire families perched on a single scooter, a small child wedged between his parents, his face a mask of sleepy contentment. Young women in stylish business suits and helmets checked their phones in traffic, their confidence an easy, natural thing. John stared out the window, his face pressed against the cool glass, feeling like he was watching a film of a city he was supposed to know but didn't. Every street corner was a collision of past and present. It felt both completely alien and hauntingly, painfully familiar. He saw a group of teenagers laughing and taking selfies in front of a gleaming glass-fronted shopping mall. On the very corner where a bombed-out building had once stood, its skeletal remains a testament to a war he tried every day to forget. He heard the joyful, unrestrained chatter of a family sharing a meal at a street stall, a stall that might have been the exact spot where he once said a hurried, tearful, and final goodbye to Mai. He kept seeing ghosts, a flash of blue silk, a now dye, just like the one she used to wear, disappearing into a crowd. The face of a young boy on the back of a motorbike, turning for just a second, his features momentarily arranging themselves into a configuration that made John's breath catch in his throat. Could that be him? Could that be his grandson? He checked into a small, clean hotel in a quiet alley off the main road. His hands were shaking so much he could barely sign the register. The young woman at the desk smiled at him, a polite, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. To her, he was just another tourist. Another old American, probably chasing ghosts. She had no idea how right she was. In his room, he didn't unpack. The suitcase remained by the door, a silent testament to the temporary nature of his visit. He simply walked over to the bed, the mattress sighing under his weight, and sat on the edge. He pulled out the photograph again. The hope. The desperate, fragile hope that had fueled him across an entire ocean was now battling a rising tide of cold, hard fear. Here, in this anonymous room, half a world from everything he knew, the reality of his quest crashed down upon him. What would his son be like? Would he be a carpenter like him? Would he have his stubborn chin? Or would he have his mother's defiant eyes? Would he be married, have children of his own? And then the most terrifying question of all, the one that coiled in his stomach like a venomous snake. Would he hate him? Would he look at John, not as a father who had finally come home, but as a coward who had abandoned him? As a ghost from a foreign war that had ruined his mother's life? John had no right to expect forgiveness. He knew that. He had no right to expect anything. But God, how he hoped for it. He had spent 50 years being a ghost in his own life. Now he was here, in a city full of them. And tomorrow morning, He would have to go out and try to find the one that mattered most. The journey across the world was over, but the real journey, the one across 50 years of silence, was just beginning. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, restless thing, a thin veil over a landscape of anxieties. John awoke not to an alarm clock, but to the gentle, insistent sounds of Ho Chi Minh City coming to life outside his window. It was a soundscape so utterly different from the Ohio mornings he was used to. The quiet rustle of leaves, the chirp of a cardinal. This was a symphony of human endeavor. A city that didn't wait for the sun, but rose to meet it. He lay there for a long time, on his back, staring at the slowly spinning ceiling fan. The fear from the night before hadn't vanished with the darkness. It had simply settled. It was no longer a frantic, panicked creature. It was now a cold, heavy weight in the pit of his stomach. A quiet, certain dread. He was here. He was alone. And he had absolutely no idea where to begin. He could spend weeks, months, wandering these crowded streets, showing his photograph to strangers and be no closer to the truth than he was right now, lying in this bed. He couldn't do this by himself. The thought was a simple, stark admission. He needed a bridge across 50 years, across a language, across a culture that was no longer his to understand. He needed a translator. The hotel clerk recommended a service, and an hour later a young man arrived. He introduced himself as Bao. He couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a crisp, short-sleeved button-down shirt and modern glasses. He moved with a quiet, easy confidence that seemed to belong to this new, modern Vietnam. But his eyes held a deep, old soul stillness, a sense of respect. They sat at a small table in the hotel lobby. The air was thick with the aroma of strong, sweet coffee. For a moment, John hesitated. This felt like a betrayal somehow. Sharing this private, sacred quest with a stranger, this boy, he had no connection to that time, no understanding of the weight John carried, but he had no choice. With a hand that still trembled slightly, John slid the worn, creased photograph across the table. Then the letter, the one with the faded address on the back. Bao picked up the photograph first, handling it with a reverence that surprised John. He studied Mai's face, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his attention to the letter, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined the elegant but aged Vietnamese script. John cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet lobby. Her name was Mai, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This was the last address I had for her. From 1972. Bao looked up from the letter, and for the first time John saw a flicker of something personal in his eyes. A deep, quiet empathy. My grandfather. He fought in the war, Bao said softly, for the North. The statement hung in the air between them, not an accusation, not a challenge, just a fact. A quiet acknowledgement of the chasm of history that separated their two worlds. John simply nodded, unable to speak. In that single silent moment, a fragile trust was formed, an understanding that they were both just sons of a history that was bigger than either of them. Bao turned his attention back to the address. He traced the faded ink with his finger. District 4, he murmured, near the old bridge. He looked up at John again, his expression now one of gentle warning. Mr. John, this area, it has changed completely. After the war and in the years since, it is not the same place. Many of the old buildings, the old street names, they are gone. It will be very difficult. John's heart sank, but he met the young man's gaze, his own eyes pleading. I know, he said. I know it's a long shot, the longest, but I have to try. It's all I have. Bao held his gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a small, firm nod. Okay, he said. We will try. The taxi ride to District 4 was like a journey back in time, but to a time John didn't recognize. They left the wide, tree-lined boulevards of the city center behind and plunged into a labyrinth of winding, impossibly narrow alleys. This was a world away from the gleaming skyscrapers and tourist cafes. Here, life was lived out in the open, spilling from the front doors of small homes and shops directly onto the pavement. The air was thick with 1,000 new smells. The pungent, fermented funk of fish sauce, the sharp, clean scent of lemongrass, the sizzle of garlic in hot oil. Electrical wires, thick as jungle vines, were strung in a chaotic web overhead, blotting out the sky. This, John realized, was closer to the Saigon he remembered. The raw, unfiltered energy of it, the sheer density of human life packed into every available inch of space. His heart began to pound a nervous, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He was closer. He could feel it. They got out of the taxi at the foot of a modern concrete bridge that had clearly replaced an older one, and they began to walk. The process was slow, painful. Bao would approach a shopkeeper or an old man sipping tea on a plastic stool, his voice a low, respectful murmur. He would present the photograph, and John would stand a few feet away, watching, his entire being focused on the stranger's face, searching for a flicker of recognition. Most of the time, there was nothing. A polite shake of the head, a sympathetic but empty shrug. The past was a country many had simply left behind, its borders closed. With each rejection, a small piece of John's fragile hope chipped away. The photograph, his sacred relic, started to feel like just a piece of old paper. The ghost he was chasing felt more and more like just that, a phantom, with no substance, no trace left in this world. They had been walking for hours. The sun was high and brutal. Sweat soaked through John's linen shirt, pasting it to his skin. His hope was beginning to fray, worn thin by the heat and the constant disappointment. He was about to suggest they stop, to give up for the day, when Bao approached one last stall. It was a humble setup, just a few baskets of exotic fruits, dragon fruit and mangosteens, presided over by a tiny, ancient woman. She had to be nearly 90. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her back bent by a lifetime of hard work. Bao began his gentle inquiry. The old woman waved a dismissive hand at first, but then she stopped. Her eyes, cloudy with age, narrowed, squinting at the photograph in Bao's hand. She reached out a small, wrinkled hand, and Bao, understanding, gave it to her. John held his breath. The old woman brought the photograph close to her face. Her finger, gnarled and brown, began to trace the outline of Mai's cheek, her hair. It was a gesture of immense tenderness. A long, silent moment passed. The chaotic noise of the alley seemed to fade into a dull roar. Then a word, a single whispered word like a forgotten melody. Mai. A jolt went through John, so powerful he stumbled a step. It was like a defibrillator to his heart. He rushed forward. Yes, he said, his voice cracking too loud. Yes, that's her. Mai. Do you know her? Do you know where she went? My son. I'm looking for my son. The old woman looked up at him, her dark eyes, seeing not just an old American tourist, but straight through him, into the past. She saw the young soldier he had been. She nodded slowly. I remember, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The girl with the sad eyes. And the American soldier. Tears welled in John's eyes, blurring the woman's face. That was me, he choked out. Please, do you know where my son is? A look of deep, ancient sadness passed over the old woman's face. She shook her head, a slow, final gesture. She left, she said, long ago, after the fighting ended. It was hard for her, for the boy. She said she had to protect him. John's hope, which had soared so high, came crashing back to earth. Gone. She was gone. But then, the old woman's eyes drifted, looking towards the hazy horizon, as if she could see something far beyond the city. She always spoke of the mountains, she continued, her voice a distant echo. Of Dalat. She looked back at John, a final piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. She said it was the only place the air felt clean. Dalat, the mountains. The words weren't an address, they weren't a destination, they were a whisper, a faint, fragile clue, rescued from the wreckage of 50 forgotten years. It was almost nothing, a ghost of a lead, but in that moment, it was everything. It was the only thing John had. The city of Ho Chi Minh, this roaring modern metropolis that held no memory of him, was a dead end. His past wasn't here, buried under the concrete and glass. It had fled. It had fled to a place where the air was clean. John felt a profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude for the old woman. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of money, but she just shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lips. She wasn't selling information. She was giving a gift of memory. He and Bao could only thank her, their words feeling clumsy and inadequate. As they walked away, leaving her to her quiet stall of brightly colored fruits, John felt a subtle shift inside him. The desperate, frantic hope of the morning had been replaced by something else. A quiet, focused resolve. He now had a direction, a name on a map. But Dalat was a city, a big one. The clue was still too faint. They couldn't just go there and start asking questions all over again. They needed more. Bao, with the quiet intuition of someone who understood the intricate, invisible web of family that held his country together, suggested they didn't give up on the city just yet. A memory like that, of a place to escape to, she would have told family, he reasoned. Even distant family, we just need to find the right thread to pull. And so their search changed. They were no longer looking for Mai. They were now looking for anyone at all, who might have a piece of her story. It was a painstaking, frustrating process. Another full day spent navigating the city's labyrinthine alleys, this time with a new sense of purpose. They followed a chain of whispers. An old neighbor remembered a cousin who had moved to District 7. That cousin remembered a niece who worked at a garment factory on the edge of the city. Each lead was a thin, fragile thread that threatened to snap at any moment. Finally, after hours that felt like days, one of the threads held. They found her, a distant cousin of Mai's, a woman named Hien, who lived in a cramped, fourth-floor apartment in a sprawling, concrete complex. The air on the stairwell was thick with the smell of cooking oil and incense. When Hien opened the door, her face was a mask of suspicion. She was a woman in her 60s, her features hardened by a life that had clearly not been easy. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over John, taking in his foreignness, his age, his expensive-looking linen shirt. The mistrust was a palpable thing, a wall built of memory and history. Bao spoke first, his voice low and respectful, explaining who John was, what he was searching for. Hien's expression didn't change. She just stared at John, her arms crossed over her chest. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. John knew this was it, his last chance. He had to break through that wall. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. He didn't speak of himself as a soldier. He didn't speak of rights or of fatherhood. He spoke only of Mai. Please, he began, his voice raspy with emotion, forcing himself to meet her hard gaze. I loved her. I never stopped. For 50 years. I need to know. I need to know my son is okay. He spoke with a raw, unguarded honesty, a 5-decade-old regret laid bare in a stranger's doorway. He saw a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible softening in the woman's eyes. The wall of suspicion didn't crumble, but a small gate seemed to creak open. She looked from John to the faded photograph in his hand, and back again. She let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. I have not seen Mai in over 30 years, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. I do not know where your son is. The words were a hammer blow. John felt his shoulders slump, the last of his energy draining out of him. It was over. He had failed. But Hien hadn't closed the door. She looked at him again, a long, searching look. But, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she left something with me, a long time ago. She told me, if a tall American man with kind eyes and a sad face ever came asking for her, I was to give it to him. John's head snapped up. His heart, which had just plummeted, now soared. Hien disappeared into the dark apartment, leaving him and Bao standing in the hallway. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. What could it be? An address? A letter? A new photograph? He could barely breathe. She returned, carrying a small, black, lacquered box. It was beautiful, inlaid with mother of pearl in the shape of a crane. It was light in her hands, almost empty. She held it out to him, not as a gift, but as a burden being passed on. He took it, his fingers fumbling. It felt cool and smooth to the touch. This was it, the key, the answer. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. His breath caught in his throat. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red silk, there was no map, no address. There was only a single sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age, and a small silver locket, tarnished and dark. He didn't know why, but he reached for the locket first. It felt cold in his palm. The clasp was stiff, and he struggled with it for a moment before it sprang open. His world tilted. On one side, protected by a tiny circle of cloudy plastic, was a miniature, faded picture of him. Young, so painfully young. In his uniform, a stupid, hopeful grin on his face. He remembered the day she took it. But the other side made no sense. It was a picture of a different man. A Vietnamese man, also in a soldier's uniform, but a different uniform. He was handsome, his face solemn, his gaze direct and proud. A cold dread, sharp and sudden as a needle, pierced through the fragile hope that had sustained John for 2 days. Who was this man? Was it her brother? He didn't remember her ever mentioning a brother in the army, a cousin, a friend. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, an innocent reason for this stranger's face to be pressed against his own in this secret, intimate space. Before he could process the impossible image, his eyes fell on the letter. His name, John, was written on the front in Mai's elegant, looping script. He handed it to Bao, his own hands now shaking too violently to hold it steady. "Please," he whispered. Bao carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to translate, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as if he knew the words he was about to speak were daggers. "My dearest John," Bao read. The words were a balm, a ghost's voice reaching across the years. "If you are reading this, it means the world has been kinder to you than it was to me. It means you came back. My heart is both full and completely broken to know this." John closed his eyes, savoring the bitter sweetness of her words. She had thought of him. She had known he would come. "I am so sorry, John." Bao's voice faltered for a second. He took a breath. "I am so sorry, but I am gone now. A sickness in my lungs. It took me many years ago." Bao's voice trailed off, but John didn't hear him. The sounds of the apartment complex, the city, the world, they all faded away into a deafening white roar. The words hit him not as sound, but as a physical impact, a punch to the gut that stole all the air from his lungs. Mai was gone. The woman whose face was his compass. The woman whose memory was the one fixed point in his chaotic life. She was dead. He hadn't just lost her to a war 50 years ago. He had lost her all over again. And this time it was forever. Grief. It isn't a wave, like they say in the books. A wave is a clean thing. It crashes and it recedes. This was not a wave. This was a suffocating blanket. A thick, heavy shroud of felt dropped over his head, stealing all the air, all the light, all the sound from the world. My was gone. The two words echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness of his mind. Not gone as in, moved away. Not gone as in, lost to time. Just gone. An ending. A final, irrevocable period at the end of a sentence he had spent 50 years hoping to finish. He didn't remember leaving the apartment. He didn't remember the walk down the 4 flights of stairs or the taxi ride back to the hotel. The entire sequence of events was a blur, a smear of muted colors and distant sounds, all viewed through the thick, distorted lens of his sorrow. He vaguely recalled Bao's hand, a steady, supportive pressure on his elbow, guiding him. He remembered the look in the young man's eyes, not of pity, but of a deep, profound compassion, a shared understanding of loss that transcended age and history and the color of one's skin. Back in the anonymous hotel room, the lacquered box sat on the small table. It was no longer a box of hope. It was a reliquary, a tiny, ornate coffin holding the ashes of a 50-year-old dream. The silver locket lay beside it, closed now. He couldn't bear to look at it. He couldn't bear to see his own young, smiling face pressed against the face of that handsome, solemn stranger. The question of who that other man was, it still lingered at the edges of his grief, a sharp, splintered piece of wood under a thumbnail. But the pain of Mai's death was so immense, so all-consuming, that it overshadowed everything else. He sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at nothing. The vibrant, chaotic city outside his window might as well have been on another planet. His journey was over. His quest had ended right here in this room. He had flown 10,000 miles across an entire ocean just to find a ghost, just to learn that he was and always had been completely and utterly alone. What was the point of going on? What was the point of Dalat now? It was Bao who gently broke the silence. He hadn't left. He had been sitting quietly in the chair in the corner, giving John the space and the dignity to grieve. "Mr. John," he said, his voice soft, "there is more. The letter. It did not end there." John looked up, his eyes feeling raw and swollen. He had forgotten. In the initial stunning impact of the news, he had forgotten there was more. He just numbly nodded. Bao picked up the fragile, yellowed paper. It trembled slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat and continued to read. "It took me many years ago, but my spirit will be at peace if I know that you have found him, my son." The words, "my son," they were a lifeline. A single, thin thread thrown to a drowning man. In the depths of his sorrow for Mai, he had almost forgotten the other reason he was here. The living reason. His name, Bao continued, his voice gaining a quiet strength, is Koi, and he lives in Dalat. He is a good man, John, a strong man. I have enclosed the address where you can find him. Please, go to him. Tell him about the boy you were. Tell him about the life you have lived. Let him see the man his mother once loved. The letter gave one final heartbreaking gift, an address, a real address, a name, Koi, and a purpose. The journey wasn't over. It had just changed. It was no longer a reunion. It was now a pilgrimage, a final duty to the memory of the woman he had lost. He had to go. For her. He had to see this through. The bus ride to Dalat was a winding 6-hour journey that felt like a funeral procession. The box, Mai's final message, sat heavy on his lap, a tombstone for the dream of a life that could have been. The bus climbed, leaving the flat, humid plains of the south behind, ascending into the misty, pine-covered highlands of the central region. The air grew cooler. The rain began to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that washed the world in shades of gray. John stared out the window, his forehead pressed against the cool, vibrating glass. The lush, impossibly green Vietnamese countryside was a blur. The terraced rice paddies clinging to the sides of the mountains like giant emerald steps. The small villages with their red-tiled roofs nestled in the valleys below. It was beautiful, a heartbreakingly, achingly beautiful country. A country he had once seen only through the lens of war and survival. Now he was seeing it through the lens of grief. He had read the letter to him again and again. He wanted to absorb every word, every nuance. He wanted to hear Mai's voice in the elegant, translated script. It spoke of her love for him, a fragile, impossible blossom, born in a time of war. But it also spoke of her sorrow, of a life of unimaginable hardship, raising a conlai, a half-breed child, in a country still raw and bleeding from its wounds. A country where a child with Western features was a constant, living reminder of a painful occupation. She wrote of the whispers, the insults, the struggle to find work, to find acceptance. The letter was full of love, yes, but it was also full of secrets he couldn't grasp. A deep, profound sadness that seemed to go beyond her own struggle. And always, his mind returned to the locket, the face of the other soldier, Anne. It burned in his memory. She hadn't mentioned him in the letter, not a single word. The omission felt louder, more significant than any explanation could have been. Who was he, to be so important yet so completely absent from her final words? John closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways over 50 years. He would find Mai. She would be older, her beautiful face etched with the lines of her life, but she would still have those defiant, brilliant eyes. He would apologize, profusely, for his youth, for his fear, for his 50 years of silence, and she would forgive him, and then she would lead him to his son, a grown man, and they would be a family, if only for an afternoon, a fractured, impossible family, finally pieced together. Now, half of that dream was ashes. He was on a bus, winding through the mountains in the rain, on his way to meet a stranger, a man who was the last living piece of a woman he had now lost twice. Once to war, and now to time itself. He was no longer going to meet his son. He was going to meet an orphan, just like him. The city of Dalat, when they finally arrived, was unlike any other place John had seen in Vietnam. The bus crested a final hill, and the city unfolded below them, nestled in a valley, wrapped in a blanket of mist and pine trees. The air that filtered through the open bus window was cool and clean and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was exactly as the old woman had described it, a place to breathe. Instead of the chaotic, roaring energy of Ho Chi Minh City, Dalat moved to a slower, more graceful rhythm. French colonial villas, with their steep, tiled roofs and shuttered windows, stood draped in waterfalls of brilliant pink and purple bougainvillea. It felt peaceful. A city suspended in time, perched in the clouds. This was the sanctuary Mai had chosen, the place she had come to protect her son. The address from the letter led them not to the center of the city, but to a quiet residential street on the outskirts, where the mist clung to the trees, and the only sound was the distant crowing of a rooster and the gentle dripping of water from the leaves. The taxi driver slowed, searching for the house number. John's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. A nervous electric energy coursed through him, making the fine hairs on his arms stand up. This was it. The end of the road. The end of a 50-year search. He wasn't ready. He would never be ready. The house was small, but immaculately kept. It was painted a soft, buttery yellow, with dark green shutters. It wasn't a grand villa, but a simple, modest home that spoke of a life of quiet dignity. But it was the garden that captured John's attention. It wasn't a manicured, perfect garden. It was a riot of life, overflowing with roses of every shade, from deep crimson to delicate blush pink, and towering hydrangeas, their heavy heads a startling shade of blue. It was a garden tended not just with skill, but with love. And in the garden was a man. He had his back to them, bent over a rose bush, patiently, methodically, tying a stray branch to a small wooden trellis. He wore simple, dark trousers and a plain, gray, short-sleeved shirt. He looked to be in his late 40s. He was lean, but with the wiry strength of someone who works with their hands. His skin was weathered by the sun, his hair thick and black, threaded with just a few strands of silver at the temples. His movements were deliberate and calm and filled with a quiet intensity. This had to be him. This had to be Coy. John felt a strange, dizzying sense of unreality. He had spent half a century picturing this moment, and now that it was here, it felt like a dream. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His hand was frozen on the car door handle. What was he supposed to do? Get out? Yell his name? What do you say to a ghost you've been chasing your whole life when you finally find him standing in a garden tending to his roses? Bao, sensing his hesitation, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. John," he said softly, "we are here." The words broke the spell. John took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the car door open. His legs, when he stood on them, felt like they were made of lead. They felt like they might not hold him. The gravel of the driveway crunched under his feet, the sound loud and intrusive in the quiet afternoon air. The man in the garden heard it. He didn't startle or turn quickly. He finished tying the knot on the trellis, his movements unhurried. Then, slowly, he straightened up, turning to face them. He had his mother's high, elegant cheekbones. The resemblance was unmistakable, and it sent a sharp, painful pang through John's heart. But his eyes were different. They weren't the fiery, defiant eyes of Mai. They were dark and deep and held a profound, unreadable calm. They were the eyes of a man who had seen much and had made his peace with it. Bao stepped forward and spoke first, a soft, polite exchange in Vietnamese. John didn't understand the words. He only watched the man's face. As Bao spoke, the man's calm gaze shifted from the young translator to him, and their eyes met. Across the garden, across 50 years of silence. In that single electric moment, John expected something. Shock, anger, confusion, surprise. He saw none of it. There was no flicker of recognition, no sudden widening of the eyes. There was just that deep, unsettling, unnerving calm, as if he had been standing in this garden, waiting for this exact moment for his entire life. The man wiped his hands on the sides of his trousers, a simple, practical gesture, and he began to walk towards them, not rushing, not hesitating, just a steady, deliberate pace. Each step on the gravel path was a drumbeat, counting down the final seconds of John's long journey. He stopped a few feet in front of them. He was taller than John had expected, and he looked directly at him, his gaze unwavering. He spoke, and the sound of his voice, a quiet, low baritone, seemed to be the most surreal thing John had ever heard. His English was heavily accented, each word carefully formed, but it was perfectly clear. "Mr. Baker," he said, the name, his name, spoken by this man. It was too much. "I have been expecting you." John's mind went completely blank. It was as if a switch had been thrown. All the speeches he had rehearsed on the plane, in the hotel room, on the long bus ride, all the apologies he had prepared, the explanations he had crafted, they all vanished, evaporated into the cool, misty mountain air. He could only stare at the face of this stranger who was supposed to be his son. He searched for a trace of himself, the shape of his nose, the line of his jaw, the color of his eyes, and he found nothing, not a single familiar echo. The man, coy, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the house. "Please," he said, "come inside. My mother would have wanted you to have some tea." He led them up the short path to the front door and into a simple, spare living room. It was spotlessly clean. The dark wooden furniture shone with polish. The air inside smelled of beeswax and tea and faintly of the flowers from the garden. It was a house filled with light and with a profound sense of peace. And there, on a small, low table in the center of the room, as if it had been placed there just moments before they arrived, was a tray. It held a small, delicate teapot and a single waiting teacup, and next to it, lying on the polished wood, was another sealed envelope, identical to the first, but the paper was newer, whiter. The world seemed to slow down. John looked from the teacup to the letter, and then to the face of the man who stood before him, the man he had come here to find, the man who was a complete and utter stranger. And he knew with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice in his heart, that he had not found the end of the story. He had only just found the beginning of the real one. Time seemed to stretch and thin and become something else entirely in that quiet, sunlit room. John stood frozen in the center of the floor, his gaze locked on the second envelope. The white, crisp paper was an omen, a final, unopened door at the end of a long, dark hallway. His journey had led him here, to this exact spot, to this final piece of paper, and every instinct in his body, every frayed nerve, screamed at him that whatever was inside that envelope was going to destroy him. Coy moved with that same unnerving, deliberate grace. He gestured to a simple wooden armchair. "Please, Mr. Baker," he said again, his voice still an even, low baritone. "Sit, drink your tea." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gentle but firm instruction, as if he were following a script, written for him long ago. John sank into the chair, his body moving on its own accord. His legs finally gave out. He felt 1,000,000 years old. Bao, who had been standing silently by the door, a respectful observer to this strange ritualistic reunion, quietly poured the tea. The fragrant steam rose in a delicate curl, carrying the scent of jasmine. John wrapped his cold, trembling hands around the small, warm cup, the heat a small, inadequate comfort against the chill that was spreading deep in his bones. Coy did not sit. He remained standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked less like a son meeting his father and more like an executor preparing to read a will. "My mother," he began, his gaze fixed somewhere over John's shoulder, as if he were looking at a ghost in the corner of the room. "She told me everything. She told me about the war. She told me about the American soldier with the kind eyes. She told me that you might come one day." He paused, and his eyes finally met John's. The calm was still there, but underneath it, John could now see something else. Not anger, not resentment. It was a profound and deeply felt sorrow. "She left this for you," he said, nodding towards the envelope on the table. "She said you must read it. You must read it before we can talk. Before we can talk." The words were a warning. The truth, whatever it was a prerequisite for any human connection between them. It was a barrier that had to be passed. John put down the teacup, his hand shaking so much that the cup rattled against the saucer, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. He reached for the letter. The paper felt different from the first one. It was newer, stiffer. The ink, when he saw his name on the front, was darker, the lines more confident, as if written by a woman who was no longer just surviving, but was at peace with her story. He didn't have to ask. He simply held it out to Bao. The young translator took it, his own face now pale with a sense of foreboding. He understood now that he was not just translating words, he was delivering a verdict. He carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the single sheet of paper. He cleared his throat and he began to read, and with the very first sentence, the foundation of John Baker's entire life began to fracture. "My John," Bao read, his voice barely a whisper. The salutation was the same, but the tone was completely different. "The first letter told you of my death. This one must tell you of my life and of my truth. I need you to listen with the same kind heart that I remember. I loved you. Please, whatever you read now, whatever you feel, never, ever doubt that. You were a light, a small warm candle in the darkest, coldest time of my life, and I will be grateful for that light for all of eternity." John held on to those words. He gripped them like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. "She loved me. It was the only thing that mattered." But Bao's voice faltered. He stopped, looking up at John, his eyes filled with a deep, pained apology. He was so sorry for the words he was about to say. John just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go on." Bao looked back down at the page. "But my heart, it was already broken when I met you. It was already in pieces. The man in the locket." The blood in John's veins turned to ice. He knew. In that instant, he knew. His name was Anne. He was my first love, my only love, for a very long time. We grew up in the same village. Our families promised us to each other when we were just children. He was my future. He was a soldier, John, just like you. He was fighting for his country, for what he believed in. He died. He was killed at the Battle of Khe Sanh 2 months before I met you. John stopped breathing. The room began to spin, the edges of his vision turning gray. He looked across at Coy, who was watching him, his face a mask of shared grief. Then he looked back at the letter, as if the words themselves might change. "No, please, no." Bao's voice was now just a pained, disembodied whisper, delivering the final fatal blows. "When An died, I did not know how to live. The world had no color, no sound, and I was already carrying his child." A low animal sound escaped John's throat, a sound of pure primal agony. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white, trying to anchor himself to a reality that was dissolving around him. "I was alone, John. I was terrified, and I was grieving a loss so profound I thought it would kill me. And then you came into my life, this gentle, kind American boy who saw me not as a grieving widow, not as a problem, but just as a woman. You offered me hope when I had none. You made me smile when I thought I would never smile again. And I let you believe the child was yours." The words fell into the silence of the room, each one a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. "I let you believe it, because I needed to believe it too. I needed a reason to protect him, to survive in a world that had taken everything from me. Your love, your protection, it became a shield for Anne's son. It gave me the strength to go on. Forgive me, John, please. If you can, forgive my desperate, broken heart." The letter ended with the final, simple, devastating truth. Coy is not your son by blood. He is the son of my An. But he is also the son of my survival, a survival that you and you alone made possible. The room didn't just spin, it dissolved. The walls, the furniture, the soft afternoon light filtering through the window. It all liquefied, melting into a meaningless blur of color and shape. There was a roaring sound in John's ears, like the static between radio stations, a sound of pure, empty chaos. 50 years. The number was an absurdity, a cruel joke. 50 years. He had carried the image of a son, a biological extension of himself, a blood connection to the woman he loved. It was the central pillar of his life's narrative, the grand defining secret that had shaped every decision, every relationship, every single, silent, lonely night. He wasn't just a failed soldier or a failed husband. He was a father, an absent father, yes, a guilty father, but a father nonetheless. It was the one secret, sacred identity he had clung to. And now, in the space of a few whispered sentences, that pillar had been pulverized, turned to dust. He wasn't a father. He had never been a father. He was just an old fool, a character in someone else's love story, a footnote. He had built his entire life, his entire architecture of regret and hope around a lie, a beautiful, tragic, heartbreaking lie. The grief for Mai, which had been a raw, open wound, was now consumed by a tidal wave of emotions so vast and contradictory he couldn't even name them. There was betrayal, yes, a deep, seismic shock of it, but there was also a strange, hollow emptiness, a feeling of being utterly untethered from his own past. If he wasn't Coy's father, then who was he? What was the point of this journey? What was the point of any of it? Through the fog of his shock, he became aware of movement. Coy. He had pulled up a small wooden stool and was now sitting directly in front of him, just a few feet away. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, watching John, and in his eyes, the deep, calm eyes that held no trace of John's own, there was no judgment, no satisfaction. There was only an expression of profound and deeply empathetic understanding. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He wasn't a lie. He was the living, breathing legacy of Mai's impossible, desperate choice. "I am sorry," Coy said, and his voice, so quiet, so gentle, cut through the roaring in John's head. "My mother, she never wanted to hurt you. She knew this truth would be a heavy stone for you to carry." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But she also knew you were strong enough to carry it." The words were a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. "She knew you were strong enough." Coy then stood up, a silent invitation in his gesture. He walked not to the door, but to a quiet corner of the room that John hadn't noticed before. It was a space of reverence. On a small, dark, intricately carved wooden altar were the traditional implements of ancestor worship. A small bowl of fresh, green-skinned oranges, a brass censer, a thin, fragrant wisp of incense smoke curling lazily towards the ceiling, and two simple framed photographs. John, his body moving as if in a trance, pulled himself out of the chair and followed. His legs were still unsteady, and he placed a hand on the back of the chair to steady himself. He walked the few steps to the altar, each footfall feeling like a monumental effort, and he looked. On the right side of the altar was the photograph from the locket, the solemn, handsome face of the Vietnamese soldier, An, forever young, forever 21, a hero to his country, and the first and only love of the woman John had loved. He was the ghost who had been there silently all along. And on the left side was the other photograph, the one Mai had kept for 50 years, the picture of him, John Baker, a 19-year-old American GI, his face full of a stupid, naive bravado, a universe of pain still waiting for him just beyond the frame. Two young soldiers, on opposite sides of a brutal, meaningless war, united here, together, on this small, sacred altar, in this peaceful house in the misty mountains of Vietnam, both loved by the same woman, both watching over her son. Khoi stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. He pointed to the picture of Anne. "My mother taught me," he said, his voice now thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "that a man can have two fathers." He looked at John, his deep, dark eyes shining with unshed tears. "This man, and he is my first father. He gave me my blood, my face, my country. He is my roots in the soil." Then he turned, and his hand moved to indicate the photograph of the young American soldier. His hand indicated John. "And you," Khoi said, his voice dropping to a near whisper of reverence. "You are my second father. You did not give me my blood, but you gave my mother the strength to bring me into this world. You gave her the hope she needed to survive. In a time of darkness, you were her light, and your light, it protected us both." He finally looked directly at John, and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "I have known your name my whole life, Mr. Baker. I have honored you both here at this altar every single day." The words, the sheer, impossible grace of the words, they were the thing that finally broke him. The 50 years of tightly controlled anger, the guilt that had eaten him alive from the inside out, the regret that was his constant waking companion, it all finally, mercifully shattered. He sank back into the armchair, not with a crash, but with a slow, boneless collapse. He buried his face in his hands, and he wept. He wept with a raw, racking, heartbroken abandon he hadn't allowed himself since he was a small boy. He wept for the beautiful, defiant woman he had lost twice. He wept for the son he had never had. He wept for the handsome, solemn soldier who had died at Khe Sanh, a boy just like him, and he wept for the incredible, astonishing man who stood before him, a man who was not his son, but who had honored him as a father his entire life, a man who was the living, breathing embodiment of a love more complex, more heartbreaking, and more powerful than he had ever, in his wildest dreams, imagined. The weeping, when it was over, left him hollowed out, empty. But it was not a painful emptiness. It was a clean emptiness, a quiet, peaceful void where 50 years of ghosts and guilt had once resided. He felt light, as if a physical, crushing weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying until it was gone. He had expected to spend the rest of his trip in a fog of grief and betrayal. He had expected to book the first flight back to Ohio, to retreat into his solitary life, to lock this new, more painful truth away with all the others. He expected the journey to be over, but it wasn't, because Khoi and the astonishing grace he offered wouldn't allow it. John stayed for 3 days, 3 quiet, simple, and utterly transformative days. Khoi insisted. "My mother would be angry," he said, with the first hint of a gentle smile John had seen on his face, "if I let my father travel all this way, only to leave so soon." The word father, spoken so easily, so naturally, still sent a strange, painful, yet beautiful jolt through John's heart. It was a name he hadn't earned, a title he didn't deserve, but it was a gift. And he was finally learning how to accept a gift. He didn't stay at a hotel. He stayed in their home, in a small, clean guest room with a window that looked out onto the riot of color in Mai's garden. And in that house, he was not a stranger. He was not an intruder or a ghost from a painful past. He was family. He met Khoi's wife, a warm, gentle woman named Lien, whose smile was as bright and welcoming as the morning sun. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, always ensuring his teacup was full, always offering him the choicest pieces of fruit. She spoke no English, and he spoke no Vietnamese, but they communicated perfectly through a shared language of smiles and nods and a mutual respect that needed no translation. And he met their children, Mai's grandchildren, a boy of 10 named Sun, and a little girl of 6 named Mai An, named for the grandmother she had never met. They were shy at first, peering at this strange, tall, white-haired old man from behind their father's legs, but their curiosity soon won over their shyness. They didn't know the complicated history. They didn't know about the war or the letters or the 2 fathers on the altar. All they knew was that this man was their Ong Guai, their grandfather, a long-lost grandfather who had finally come home. And so, in the slow, peaceful rhythm of their daily life, the deep, ragged wounds inside John began to heal. They didn't talk about blood. They didn't talk about biology or lies or secrets. They just lived. John would sit in a chair in the garden for hours, watching Koi work. He would watch the same strong, patient hands that he had first seen tying up a rose bush, now gently cultivating the soil, pulling weeds, nurturing the life that Mai had planted there. It was a form of meditation, a wordless conversation. In the evenings, they would sit together in the simple living room, and they would share stories. John, with Bao translating, would talk about his own youth, about growing up in the rolling green hills of Ohio, about learning carpentry from his father, about the cold winters and the smell of sawdust, and the simple, uncomplicated life he had lived before the war came and changed everything. And Koi would share stories of his own, stories of growing up in post-war Vietnam. He spoke without bitterness, without anger, just a quiet recitation of the facts. He talked about the struggle, the poverty, the constant low-level prejudice of being a child who looked different. But mostly, he talked about his mother. And through Koi's memories, through the eyes of the boy who had been her entire world, John finally got to know the woman Mai had become. She wasn't the fragile, sad-eyed girl he had left behind. She was a lioness, a fierce, resourceful, and unbelievably resilient mother who had built a life for her son from the ashes of her grief. He learned how she had worked 3 jobs, how she had taught herself to read and write English so she could help him with his lessons, how she had faced down insults and prejudice with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He learned about the money, the small amounts he had tried to send for years after the war, the envelopes that had always been returned to him, unopened. He had always assumed it was because she hated him, that she wanted nothing from him. But the truth was so much more beautiful than that. She couldn't accept it for herself. Koi explained one evening, his voice full of a deep, quiet pride. It was a matter of honor, but she didn't throw it away. He told John how Mai, with the help of a local pagoda, had used that money to create a small, informal fund, a fund to help other children who had been orphaned by the war on both sides. She had turned his gesture of guilt into an act of grace. The knowledge settled in John's soul, a warm and healing balm. He was not just a painful part of her past, a mistake to be forgotten. He was woven into the fabric of her entire incredible life. She had taken his kindness, his small, inadequate gesture, and she had multiplied it. She had transformed it into something beautiful. He wasn't the father of her son, but he had, in his own small way, been the guardian of her hope. On the final day, the morning of his flight back to Ho Chi Minh City, the air was cool and crisp. The mist was slowly burning off the mountains. As Koi drove him to the small local airport, a comfortable, easy silence settled between them. They had said everything that needed to be said, and they had understood everything that didn't. The journey was over. The quest, his 50-year quest, had failed in every single one of its original selfish purposes. He had not found the woman he loved. He had not found his biological son, but it had succeeded in ways he could never, ever have foreseen. As they stood at the small departure gate, the final boarding call for the short flight echoed through the terminal. It was time to go, time to leave this place of ghosts and truth and astonishing grace. John looked at the man before him, the son of the woman he loved, the man who had called him father. He finally understood. It had never been about blood. It had never been about biology. It had been about connection, about love, about a promise kept across a lifetime. He had come to Vietnam to find a piece of himself. He had come to hold his son's hand. And as the final boarding call sounded, John did what he had crossed an ocean to do. He reached out his old, trembling carpenter's hand, and he took Koi's. It was strong and warm and calloused from years of working in his mother's garden. He held it firmly, and Koi held it back. It wasn't the hand of a biological son. It was the hand of a man connected to him by a bond of love and memory and profound and beautiful sacrifice. It was Mai's legacy. It was Anne's legacy. And now, it was his legacy too. In that single quiet moment, holding that hand, the war inside John Baker, the 50-year war of guilt and regret and loneliness, finally, mercifully, ended. The touch was real, solid, the calloused strength in Koi's hand, gripping his own. It was an anchor in a world that had, for 3 days, felt like a dream. For a long moment, they just stood there, two men from two different worlds, two different generations, connected by the ghost of a woman they had both loved. There were no more words to say. There was nothing left to explain. Everything was in that simple, human touch. John finally let go, his hand falling back to his side, but the feeling of that grip, the warmth and the strength of it lingered. He gave Koi one last long look. He saw the kindness in his eyes. He saw the quiet dignity in his posture. He saw Mai. He saw her strength, her resilience, her incredible capacity for grace. She was not gone, not really. She was standing right here, in front of him, in the heart of the son she had raised. He managed a small, watery smile. A smile of pure, unadulterated peace. Koi smiled back, a mirror of the same emotion. And then John turned. And he walked away. He walked towards the gate, his back straight, his steps no longer heavy with the weight of the past. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He wasn't leaving anything behind anymore. He was taking it all with him. The flight back to Ho Chi Minh City, and then the long 18-hour journey back across the Pacific was profoundly different from the one that had brought him here. The purgatory was gone. The restless, anxious energy had been replaced by a deep and abiding calm. He slept. For the first time in what felt like years, he truly, deeply slept. And when he dreamed, there were no jungles, there were no ghosts of war-torn boys. He dreamed of a garden, overflowing with roses and hydrangeas. He dreamed of the scent of jasmine tea and the quiet, melodic sound of a woman's laughter. He had come to Vietnam to find a piece of himself, to find a biological link, a tangible genetic claim to his past. He had been on a mission, fueled by a selfish 50-year-old need for absolution, a need to find a son so that he could finally forgive himself. But he had found something so much more profound. He had found closure, not the neat, tidy closure of a Hollywood movie, where all the broken pieces are perfectly put back together. This was a different kind of closure, a real kind. Messy and complicated and heartbreakingly beautiful. He had found the truth. Not the simple truth he had been looking for, but a much deeper, more complex truth. A truth about love that transcended bloodlines and borders and even the bitter divisions of war. A truth about a remarkable woman whose love was so powerful it could create a family from the most impossible of circumstances, a family that included two soldiers from opposite sides of the world. He thought about the altar, the two photographs standing side by side, Anne, the father of blood, and John, the father of hope. He had spent his life believing he was a void in his son's life, a gaping, empty space. But he was wrong. He wasn't a void. He was a presence, a quiet, constant, and honored presence. Mai had made sure of that. He was not returning to Ohio, the same man who had left. The ghost he had carried for 50 years had not been exorcised. It had been transformed. The guilt had been replaced by a deep and humbling gratitude. The regret had been replaced by a quiet and profound pride. Pride in the woman Mai had been, and pride in the incredible man she had raised. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below, a soft white blanket covering the world. He realized with a clarity that was as sharp and bright as the sun on the horizon that a family isn't just about the blood you share. It's about the stories you keep. It's about the memories you honor. It's about the love you hold for people, even after they are gone. In a small house in the misty mountains of Vietnam, he had a family, a grandson named Sun, a granddaughter named Mai Un, and a man, a good and honorable man, who would continue to light incense for him at an altar for the rest of his life. He was not alone. He had never been alone. When he finally landed back at LAX, the chaotic hum of the terminal no longer felt overwhelming. It just felt like a part of the world, a world he was finally, fully a part of again. As he walked through the arrivals gate, he felt a strange new lightness in his step. The photograph was still in his pocket. It would always be in his pocket, but it was no longer a heavy, sacred relic of his guilt. It was just a picture now, a picture of a beautiful, defiant girl he had loved a long time ago, a picture of a memory he could now hold with tenderness instead of with pain. The journey was over. He had failed in his mission. And in that failure, he had found his salvation. It was more than a journey. It was a homecoming. The most powerful stories are not the ones about war or politics or grand events. They are the small human stories, the ones that are etched into the quiet corners of our history. They are the echoes of choices made in impossible times, of love that was lost and found in the most unexpected of ways, and of a peace that was, finally against all odds, discovered. These are the stories that connect us. They remind us that our past is never truly past, and that sometimes the longest journeys are the ones we must take inside our own hearts. If you want to hear more stories that connect us to our shared humanity, to the echoes of our past, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Echoes of the Past. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.